The desire to go further has been a part of the American dream since the founding of our great nation. We saw the impossible, and we made it possible.
The year is 2003, and Season 4 of For All Mankind is poised to ask the question, what if we ended the space race so that we could change the focus from space exploration for exploration's sake and make it all about mining mineral-rich asteroids because they're valuable? What could possibly go wrong? It's good to be back in the alternate timeline, and Season 4 continues the show's tradition of opening with a newsreel montage that fills in some of the blanks surrounding world events that happened in the 8-year gap since the Season 3 finale. I'll keep up with my tradition of doing a separate video to break down that and the mini episodes from the For All Mankind watch page on Apple TV+, because there's really too much there to get into in this video. I will hit the key things you need to know to understand what's happening in this episode, and then encourage you to check out the timeline video for more details. The episode proper opens on the Mars colony Happy Valley base, which is a lot bigger than the last time we saw it. When we were last there in the Season 3 finale, the remaining crew agreed to stay behind so that Kelly Baldwin, who was pregnant, could return to Phoenix. This meant that they would be stranded until another ship could make the return trip to pick them back up. In the opening newsreel, we learned that that did happen, but interestingly, Danny Stevens is not included in the picture with the rest of the returning crew. Of course, he had been exiled because of his inaction during the mining disaster that killed 2 astronauts and the cosmonaut who was the father of Kelly's unborn child. That disaster made abandoning Mars seem like a real possibility. But in the years in between, the idea of mining those valuable asteroids has led to continued interest. So I guess in some cases there is an upside to greed. A few things have changed the face of this. First, advancements in engine technologies have made the trip a lot shorter than it used to be, which also means they don't have to wait for specific launch windows anymore. Helios also lost its exclusive government contracts to mine helium-3 on the moon after a court battle, causing it to shift its focus to landing different exclusive contracts related to the expansion of Happy Valley. Also, as mentioned, this time it isn't a race because in her second term, President Wilson made her top priority to create the Mars 7 Alliance. The idea here is to end the competition that characterized the space race and usher in a new era of cooperation and partnership, which sounds great, but it's also worth mentioning that with everything shifting from exploration to a period of resource extraction, priorities will also change. I'll get into this in more detail in the timeline video, but the Mars 7 Alliance includes the United States, the Soviet Union, the European Space Agency member nations, the Coalition of Communist Countries, Japan, India, and North Korea. This pretty much covers every nation you might expect to have a space program in Europe, the Americas, and the whole world, except for the 2 notable exceptions they mention, China and Canada. The season opens as the first step of that gets underway. Ed Baldwin is now the executive officer at Happy Valley, which gives him the ability to assign himself to any mission he desires. Apparently, he lost a card game against his Soviet counterpart, Grigory Kuznetsov, which means that Ed will miss another chance to be first, as Kuz is poised to be the first man to step foot on an asteroid. We watch him make a successful approach, as do the Russians at Roscosmos Mission Control and NASA at the Molyakov Space Center. Lenara Katish is still the director of the Soviet space program, but a brand new character has stepped into that role at NASA. They have recruited businessman Eli Hobson to shepherd the agency through the early aughts and into the 21st century. Hobson is a former auto industry CEO who appears to be based on Lee Iacocca. He describes the current mission as the beginning of a new era, one where the Mars mission is self-supporting from all those asteroids out there, which they just need to wrangle into Mars's orbit so that they can mine them. Kuz's accomplishments deliver some of that wonders of space scene magic the show excels at, while all the talk about what amounts to a gold rush serves as the signpost to remind us that things never go as smoothly as you'd like out there in the unforgiving void. It was a bit of a surprise when the camera cuts away to show the flight director and we saw that it wasn't Aleida. Instead, we see her at a terminal in thrust, which will all make sense later. There are two things I'm a sucker for at the beginning of every new season of For All Mankind. That opening montage that I mentioned, and watching Margo wake up, which in each of the previous seasons has taken place inside her office at what used to be called JSC. Things have taken a big turn for NASA's former director, who wakes up in Russia where she's getting older and doesn't seem to have a lot to do. We get a quick look at her morning routine where she battles the cold with a noticeable limp and makes a stop at a bakery and a newsstand where we see that she's somewhat adjusting to things. These people know her at least, and she seems to have enough Russian to accomplish those tasks. Then she goes to a park to read a paper, which seems to indicate that she's not currently working at Roscosmos. In Baton Rouge, Louisiana, we meet another new character named Miles. He's a former offshore oil platform worker who is out of work thanks in part to the shift away from fossil fuels. He's on the verge of losing his wife and kids to divorce, but is hoping to get a job working on the moon to turn things around. Danielle Poole has stepped away from NASA. We catch up with her at Danny's daughter Avery's 9th birthday party. It's nice to see her transition into civilian life, but 4 seasons in, it certainly feels like a setup for her returning to space. There's no direct mention of Danny, but Amber's saying that every year it gets a little easier, coupled with his absence in the crew photo, would seem to confirm that Danny died on Mars, which is something that appears to haunt Danielle. It may also haunt Ed, who we see watching a video message from Kelly. We see that her son is growing fast and that she wants Ed to return so that she can get a break from Alexei's mother, who is staying there to help out. We see that he's experiencing a tremor in his right hand, and then we watch as they complete the preparations on the anchors and harness to collect the asteroid. In this scene, we also meet 2 contractors, Parker and Samantha Massey. We see how these workers are motivated by their bonuses, and see that there's a little bit of resentment when she says that he gets the glory and we do all the work. It kind of feels like you could flip a coin to decide which one of these characters is going to not make it through the episode, and we'll see later how that plays out. While Ranger 1 is getting ready to tow the asteroid, Miles goes over to Helios to find out there are a lot of people trying to get the same job working on the moon. He's worried and decides to lie and say that he went to Florida State, which does turn out to help him in the short term. The interview goes well, but he learns that he'd have to wait 2 years for the next available slot, which is something he can't do. In his final plea, he finds out that he might be able to go to Mars for what would be a longer tour, but would also have a bigger payday. In space, things start to go wrong when some of those cable anchors fail on the asteroid. The safe bet would be to detach and abort the mission, but Grigori wants to go out and try to fix them. The commander orders them to stay inside, but Kuz ignores that, and in an effort to get his bonus, the non-astronaut worker goes with him. This does go as wrong as it can. The rigging starts to come apart, and Parker is killed almost immediately. Kuz has his leg trapped, which puts a hole in his suit so that he's losing oxygen. Ed is 100% ready to put on an emergency suit and go try to rescue him, but his friend assures him that it's already too late. In order to protect the ship and all the lives on board, Ed is forced to go through with the emergency disconnect, and that ends the story of the first Soviet on Mars and the first human to step foot on an asteroid. Because of the communication delay, this is already played out by the time NASA starts receiving data about what's going on. We can see that this triggers memories in Aleida about the bombing, and she freezes at her station before getting up and walking away from her post. It's clear she has unresolved mental health issues from what she went through at the end of season 3. And later we'll see that after the incident, she stays at home and doesn't take calls from work when they try to check in on her. Danielle learns about the current Mars tragedy from a news report where they really lean into this idea of the regular workers being disposable, with a chyron that reads, "Soviet hero Kuznetsov, 1 other killed," which doesn't even mention Parker's name. You see some of the ripple effects when Miles talks to his wife, who's now worried about him going to Mars after the accident. And then the news also makes it to Margo, who we see try and fail to get through to Lenora at Roscosmos. She gets on a bus and then is met at the entrance of Star City by someone who isn't happy to see that she came there unannounced. She's clearly missing the work, but he points out that it's been so long since she was the director of NASA that most of the tech she's familiar with is now obsolete. He does mention that she has a regularly scheduled meeting, but from what we know about this character who has devoted their entire life to space exploration, we know that she's essentially been in hell for the last 8 years. Later, as we see her enjoying an Egg McMuffin in that same park she was at earlier, we see that she's approached by a mysterious woman who knows who she is. She cryptically tells her a story about the patient migratory birds that she's feeding, saying it's winter but spring is coming, and that Margo also needs to be patient. She leaves a plain white business card with a telephone number on it when she leaves, which Margo does pick up. The asteroid disaster also led to an invitation to the Molly Cobb Space Center for Danielle, Director Hobson, who proudly displays the boots she wore when she became the first American on Mars in his office, which you have to wonder if that's something he set up specifically for this meeting, wants her to be the replacement commander at Happy Valley. We get a little bit of an idea of why he was brought in to lead NASA. Projects were behind schedule and over budget, and a clearer picture of why she agreed to meet with him even though she doesn't have any desire to go back to work at NASA. Kuz was her friend. The two of them became close in the time they were stranded on Mars while Ed was still reeling from what happened to Karen. She says he was her rock and that he's the reason that she's there, while Eli acknowledges what a rough time that must have been and uses that by saying it will all have been in vain if they don't get the asteroid mining project back on track. She's reluctant and lays that all out when she runs into Will in the hall, who it looks like things are going pretty well for. He works in astronaut affairs and he's getting married legally, which is a big change from where things were at last season. Since he was on Mars with her, she can tell him the truth. She's not sure if she can go back because of what happened in the end with Danny. He reassures her that wasn't her fault and that she just did what she had to do as commander. And I mean, come on, we know she's going back up there. So the episode ends by confirming that. We see her on a ship getting ready to head to Mars. We also catch a glimpse of Miles in the back with other workers. And then it cuts to Ed alone in his quarters at Happy Valley, smoking a joint. And we do see a slight tremor in his left hand this time, which might indicate that the cannabis helps him with whatever condition he has going on there. But medicinal or not, since there was no mention of an early legalization movement in this alternate timeline, it appears that Exo Baldwin is exhibiting a rebellious streak here. I really enjoyed this premiere because it does exactly what I want to show that I'm this familiar with to do at this point in its run. Remind us of what we love about the series and then give us a taste of what's to come. I liked it quite a bit more than the Season 3 premiere, even though it follows the same fundamental path. And that doesn't seem like a bad thing since I haven't grown tired of any of this yet. If I'm being fair, Season 3 did have a tougher transition to make in some ways. By Season 4, we're used to the young actors playing older characters with some pretty unconvincing makeup and wigs at times. We've also settled into the idea that they will have to be replaced. And with Danny and Jimmy appearing to be out of the picture, that opens up the door for some more interesting new characters to follow. And while on some level you'd like to see them just continue to explore the solar system without anything getting in the way of progress, it seems like that would start to stress the limits of what's possible in the short term from the show's premise of a brighter future from a prolonged space race. Miles and this idea of the haves versus the have-nots and the potential gold rush seems to be a good path to take at this point in history. Because if you think about it, this type of situation feels inevitable. And if 9/11 and the Iraq War don't exist in this timeline, then from the Western perspective, the financial crisis of 2008 would be the defining event of that decade. And while that might not play out in the same way given the timeline changes, the underlying issues that made that a reality still seem to largely exist in the show's version of events. There were a lot of questions at the end of Season 3, and the more I think about it, I'm okay with the way the show is moving on. For example, I'd like to see more of Ellen in the show, but at the same time, knowing she got reelected and made her mark in the in-between years, knowing that she's married to Pam and that they're off living their lives together works. And it's nice that they could bring her back if the right situation presents itself. The first time I watched this episode, it jumped out right away that Larry isn't present in the montage at all. And he's a character that we spend a lot of time getting to know, but the way this show is set up with the time jumps, things are going to just keep moving forward. I imagine that we'll get a more complete story about what happened in the end for Danny Stevens. But you can basically piece together the likely outcome based on the way things played out. We know it affects the other characters, and that seems more important than the details of his final days. All of that is to say that we have a roster of active characters who all have a lot going on. Ed, the oldest member of the Old Guard, is coming to the end of his run. Sending Danielle Poole back to Mars could reignite their friendly rivalry, but it also could lead to them working together as he reaches the end of his story. I'm curious to see how things play out for Aleida because of her experience in the bombing, but also in how that was on top of finding out that her mentor was compromised by the Soviets. I imagine that she believes Margo died in the attack, so there's a lot they can work with there. Ms. Madison's situation is the one I'm most interested in because I think it's difficult to see where they're heading. The episode was titled Glasnost, which translates to openness or transparency, and in our timeline, a term that was associated with Gorbachev's attempts at reforms that didn't exactly work out. There are some historical events they could use there, similar to the way they used KAL Flight 007 last season. It's hard to say for sure, but I did notice that the actor who plays Irina, who gave Margo the number in the park, is listed up there with the cast regulars on the Apple PR site. And you would expect them to develop a character who would work alongside of her. In addition to that, the actor who plays the worker who was friends with Parker is also listed there, which I presume means that she'll be sharing scenes with Miles. It looks like Deb has been sidelined for the most part, so we have his return to look forward to. And beyond that, they're going to have to do something with Kelly to keep her involved as the story progresses. I'm excited and looking forward to seeing where we go from here, and I think that's a great place to leave things. Please like this video if you enjoyed it. Please subscribe to my channel if you haven't already. Make sure to check back for the timeline changes video, and thanks for watching. I'll talk to you soon.